de la detección y modelación. Se ha involucrado por más de 20 años en la conservación de sistemas socioecológicos en conjunto con varias ONG y con algunas instancias como el Servicio Canadiense de la Vida Silvestre y el Departamento de Recursos Naturales de Nueva Escocia, con la finalidad de realizar investigaciones focalizadas en problemas de biología de la conservación que son de carácter urgente. Welcome back to our Coloquio, and our next guest is Dr. Phillip Taylor from Acadia University in Canada. Dr. Taylor did his science master in Waterloo University and got his PhD at the Carleton University in Ottawa. His research interests are focused on the role of landscape shaping movement patterns, distribution and population dynamics of several animal groups, using tools as GIS, teledetection, and modeling. He's been working over 20 years in the conservation of socio-ecological systems, along with several NGOs and other institutions such as Wildlife Canadian Services and the Natural Resource Department, with the aim to develop studies in conservation biology that are essential to cope with. We welcome Dr. Taylor.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you about my work. It's a great pleasure to be able to come to talk to a group of students and interact with you. And I have to say that everything's been you've done wonderfully. I really appreciate all of the efforts that get me here. As was mentioned, I've spent most of my career looking at animal movement and landscape structure. Really, the sort of impetus for this is trying to understand that movement as a fundamental process and how animals moving interacting with landscapes produce the patterns of distribution and abundance that we see, and then how that knowledge can be used to help us make informed conservation decisions. And I think that's not atypical, it's a pretty typical motivation for scientists such as myself, and we've heard that from some of the other people that have talked today and some of the people that look I speak very good Spanish, enough to get here. So my apologies for that. I wish I could speak more, but if there's something you don't understand or you want me to explain, just put up your hand or talk to me after the breaks. It was great having Victor give that wonderful presentation earlier because he laid out a lot of the groundwork in a lot more detail. I'm going to superficially go over some of those things at the beginning of my talk to relate the context for what I'm talking about. And I'll just say one more thing, and that's that this talk is really focused on my current work and what I've tried to do. So it's going to be a description of a couple of projects that students and I have done over the last couple of years. I'm trying to put it into this landscape connectivity resilience context. So a few key points, and these are things that Victor went over in much more detail earlier, but one of them is we need to think about movement as a key ecological process. In my view, it's one of the key ecological processes in landscapes because effectively, when you start looking at scales beyond the sort of normal habitation of an individual, then movement is involved. If you start looking at evolution, gene flow, genetics, movement is involved. So movement is is sort of one of the fundamental ecological processes, and particularly in landscapes. And another thing that was brought up by Victor that is incredibly important is that an ecological process like movement acts at multiple scales and hierarchical scales. And by hierarchical, what I mean is that the process that's acting with one scale is interacting with similar or other processes at higher, broader scales and at finer scales. And so it's that sort of interaction of those processes across scales, I think, that makes the study of movement challenging, the study of landscape ecology challenging. And again, I think Victor tried to get at that in a slightly different way. So that idea that processes are interacting with the scales above them and the scales below them in different ways, enhancing and constraining some function, is really what resilience is all about. And I'll go into that in a little bit in the next slide, but resilience comes into play as a very broad theoretical construct for all of this stuff, and I think quite useful. And I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I'd be interested in talking to others about it later. And then, more specifically, with respect to connectivity, a very simple way of viewing connectivity is the way that movement processes are interacting with the underlying landscape. So I think of connectivity really as that interaction between movement processes and landscape structure. So just briefly now, a little bit more about resilience. And I've distilled this down to a single slide with the word panarchy at the top. Panarchy is a word that was coined by Buzz Holland, who's really the premier scientist to explore the concept of resilience and develop the theory. And the idea of panarchy is that you have ecological systems, so this symbol is just a representation of an ecological system through time, and I won't go into the details. And whatever scale you choose to study, the focal scale will be a scale above and a scale below. And it's this interaction among scales that leads to complexity, and that interaction comes from the variables at this scale interacting, constraining, or enhancing what's going on the scale below or the scale above. And another really useful way of thinking about this is that these very broad scale variables are often slow variables. They're variables that vary over a very long time period. So evolution is a slow variable. So is landscape succession, whereas fast variables are ones that happen very quickly on a daily scale or a seasonal scale, things like fire and so on. So thinking about the ecological process of movement in landscapes in terms of these slow and fast variables and interacting over this hierarchy of scales is what Buzz Holland termed panarchy. So some of the problems, and again, these were outlined nicely by Victor, is that you need to study any given ecological process at the appropriate scale, which is really easy to stand up here and say, but it's actually incredibly difficult to do because we, first of all, usually don't know what the appropriate scale is, and if we try to guess, we usually get it wrong. And then when you actually do determine what the appropriate scale for something is, it's usually broad and actually difficult to get a handle on. But if we don't do this, then what we tend to do, I think, is find support for hypotheses that only kind of paint part of the picture, and that can be quite damaging in terms of landscape conservation policy, all of those kinds of things, because they lead us down long paths, suggesting manipulations or suggesting policy that really isn't dealing with a particular issue. So to protect a process in a landscape, we need to know the scales, and if we're thinking about protected areas, we have to recognize that protected areas are never going to encompass all of the important ecological, I should say, scales, and we need to look beyond them. boundaries in order to do that, deal with them properly. So that's the kind of context, a very kind of condensed version of a lot of what Victor said earlier. And what I'm going to focus on now for the rest of the talk is some of my studies of the movement ecology of songbirds in landscapes that are an attempt to try to better understand that movement process and how the scale at which animals are moving during different periods of their life cycle and how they interact with landscapes. So migratory birds are a nice system to work with when we're looking at movement processes because they move around, they're migratory. Before we started this morning, we were to Wilson's warblers back in the botanical garden, and I was seeing Wilson's warblers up in Nova Scotia about 3 weeks ago. So at least some of them are making their way down through here, and many, many more do. So they're moving at very, very broad spatial scales and interacting with landscapes at very broad spatial scales, which is unlike a lot of other organisms. So they're doing that in their spring and fall migratory periods. During their breeding wintering grounds, they tend to be a lot more sedentary, but they're still interacting with the landscape, and they're still moving around. They're moving around at a finer scale, looking for shelter, looking for food, and so on. All of the things that they're doing during breeding, wintering, they're also doing during these migration periods. So when they're making big, long-distance movements, they still have to interact with the landscape at the finer scales in order to acquire food and shelter. So you've got this potential for the interaction between movement at two spatial scales. I think the other interesting thing about migratory birds is that they can sort of challenge the conventional notions of connectivity, and that is that they can move in different ways at different times of the year, depending on the behavioral state. And so a landscape that is connected for a species of bird for one particular process, like natal dispersal, or that is not connected for one particular process, like natal dispersal, may be completely connected for another process, like migration. And so it brings it into that question that it makes us think about what we actually mean by connectivity. And it introduces a number of new groups, new problems for the conservation of species, because you not only need to think about breeding and wintering areas, but you also need to think about the migratory routes and how do we protect landscapes that include migratory routes of birds that travel thousands of kilometers, and then the places where they stop over, they choose to stop and refuel as they continue their migratory journey. Where are those places? How big are they with scale? Do the birds interact with at those places? How many are there? Which ones are important? How do they change through time? All of those things are very, very important for the species, but are a real challenge when you're thinking about landscape scale conservation. So one of the motivations for my work over the last 10 years has been to try to figure out how to look at patterns of movements of small migratory birds over very broad spatial scales. And to that end, I've developed with a number of other colleagues and institutions a system of automated VHF telemetry towers to allow us to study the movements of small birds at continental scales. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but I'm happy to talk about it with anybody. The real key components of this are that we have digitally encoded tags. These are standard wildlife telemetry tags that probably a lot of you have used. They emit a coded signal though, and so we can put many individuals, up to 10,000 different individuals that emit a coded signal on the same frequency. And then we can erect towers like this one with receivers. We've developed an open source hardware software receiver, which you can buy commercial receivers, that sit and listen 24 hours a day on a particular frequency and record those coded signals. The tags are very light, so we can put them on small birds. Here's the silver-haired bat, so put them on bats, and a black-throated blue warbler. There's the little transmitter. Goes on with the leg harness, and you can see, you just barely see the antenna coming down to the tail here. And you can detect a bird flying by a tower from about 15 or 20 kilometers away, which gives us a relatively high level of geographic precision of location relative to things like geolocated devices. So here's just some pictures of different towers. This is our tower, further south tower. It's in Colombia, just north of Bogota. This is one up on one of the islands that I work on in Nova Scotia. And this is one in southern Ontario. So we put these towers on mountaintops and high peaks, like cell phone towers, wherever we can, and set them up with solar towers and batteries, and they run all year round. Download data from them periodically and process the data to get detections of individuals. Here's a pattern location of all of the towers in 2015. So you can see it's highly concentrated to eastern North America and Canada, the Maritimes down the east coast of the US. Here's our Colombia towers, and the scattered towers up through the Canadian Arctic and in the west. This is growing almost exponentially. We've got towers next year. We'll have towers all the way down the Florida coast. We're working on towers in the Caribbean. We have a partner here in Mexico who's going to work with us to set up 2 or 3 towers next year, and set up towers in Panama to get birds as they move down through the isthmus of Panama into South America. Here's just a close-up. You can see some of these towers like fences, so that a bird moving north is likely to be detected regardless of where it goes. And in other places we have more dense clusters. And what this allows us to do, essentially depending on the density of towers that we put up, is to look at movements at multiple spatial scales. It gets back to this idea of looking at multiple and hierarchical spatial scales. Songbird movements, as I've already mentioned, processes at different scales, so fine scale movements, things like nest building and foraging. Broad scale movements, distribution patterns and migration, and regional scale movements, the ones that are sort of in between. And a lot of what I'll focus on in the rest of the talk are these regional scale movements, because in my view, we have a lot of good techniques to get at patterns of fine scale movement and patterns of broad scale movement, but many fewer techniques to look at these sort of regional scales. And to make the long story short, there are a lot of very interesting and surprising patterns of movement going on at these regional scales. So I'm going to talk about 2 species today. We've worked on almost 20 different species now, and there are over 30 different institutions that are collaborating in this project. So we've done lots of work on things from bats to dragonflies to shorebirds. But I'm going to focus on 2 passerines. This one is called black-hole warbler. You don't see it here in Mexico, except under extraordinary circumstances. And this one's called Ipswich sparrow. You also don't see it here. Black-hole warblers breed in the boreal and migrate on a transoceanic route to South America. And Ipswich sparrows breed on Sable Island, which is offshore Nova Scotia in winter in the coastal U.S. Okay, these are just showing their migratory routes. So that's black-hole warbler, breeding grounds, migrating over the ocean, over winter in South America, and then migrating up through the Caribbean in the spring. And there's there's the wintering breeding grounds of Ipswich sparrow, Sable Island, and then available to them. And the two students that have done this work, one of my students at Acadia, and Zoe Chrysler, also at Acadia. So the questions for both of these studies have been quite similar, and they're really asking how does age influence movement for the two species? Or another way of thinking about it is how do we look at age as a mechanism for inferring how these individuals learn their migratory routes, which is in fact a kind of broader scale means of assessing how they interact with landscape structure and how that changes through time. So, as I mentioned, that has implications for concepts of landscape connectivity, particularly with respect to the scales of the processes that we're looking at, and then the scale of the conservation action that you might want to take if you're interested in conserving these birds. And here in this talk, I'll focus on two scales, the post-breeding and pre-migratory movements. So these are movements that the birds make after they finish breeding, but before they initiate migration. And that's a huge gap in our knowledge. We don't know much about it. And then at a broader scale, the timing, the route selection, movement, and behavior during the fall migratory period. So we'll start with the Ipswich sparrow. It's a subspecies of savanna sparrow. As I mentioned, breeds out on Sable Island. This is a picture of Sable Island. There are, I think, 3 trees on Sable Island. It's dominated by grass and sedge, and there's feral horses that have been out there for several centuries. Ipswich sparrow is really the only passerine that breeds out there, and there are no predators. So they have several broods, up to 4 broods in the season, lots of productivity in the winter along the Atlantic coast. Adults and juveniles often obviously have different requirements within that landscape, and so they use the landscape in different ways. And so this obviously is going to have some influence on the notion of connectivity for those species. And when we started looking at post-breeding, we were interested in a number of different hypotheses for why individuals would move. And I don't want to go into the detail, we don't really have time, but some of those hypotheses are very small scale. They deal with habitat choice or habitat choice the next year, and others at broader scale have to deal with navigation or finding a suitable habitat for stopover sites. What's interesting, though, is that is asking questions about the migratory routes of the species and whether those migratory routes are innate. That is, do they just know where to go, or are they learned? And the challenges obviously differ substantially with the 2 ages. Young birds are in better body condition usually than adults. Adults have finished breeding, they molt later, so the condition is good. But young birds don't forage as efficiently, aren't as good at avoiding predators, have yet to develop good orientation abilities, and don't know much about stopover selection, and don't know much about crossing water barriers. So by looking at how juveniles respond to young birds respond to their choice of movements and migratory routes, comparing that to adults, can tell us a lot about those challenges, whether they are or aren't challenges, and how they change through time. So to do this, we had set up this large-scale telemetry array. So this is just zooming in on the upper Gulf of Maine around Nova Scotia and Bay Fundy. Here's Sable Island Out here, we have towers all down the coast of Nova Scotia and all along the Gulf of Maine. And that's the regional scale, and then at the local scale, here's Sable Island. It's about 40 kilometers long and about 1 kilometer wide, the widest one. And we have towers at 2 lighthouses in the main body of the island, and the towers are in the Spitz. So we're able to look at movements on the island prior to the initiation of migration, and we're able to look at movements after they initiate migration down the coast of Maine. So 2 very different spatial scales. We tagged 64 birds in late August, 33 fledglings, and then the rest divided between adult males and adult females. We targeted individuals from the first group just so that they were reasonably well developed and we knew had survived. And they were all tagged within 1 kilometer of this Westlake receiving station. It's actually quite difficult to get around on the island, and so to simplify our lives. Here's a picture of one of the students with the misnets, and the greatest difficulty people face up there, besides the fog, is the horses running into the misnets. So to just summarize those local movements, we have a lot of detail on that, but I think one of the key things is that adults were only ever detected at the tagging site. They don't move. So adults are there, they breed, and then they hunker down, and they don't move for over 2 months. Some of them may breed again, but basically they just keep their territories and defend them. The adults, or the juveniles, on the other hand, quickly disappear from this Westlake tagging station. And almost all juveniles were found moving back and forth across the island. So this is a scale of 40 kilometers, making repeated flights prior to initiating migration. This is over a period of at least 3 weeks, and we had several individuals make these flights from Westlake all the way to Eastlake and all the way back before they're initiating migration. So those movements immediately post-breeding, which are really constrained for the species because they have to occur on this very, very isolated island. Once they leave the island, they've effectively initiated migration. Turn out to be incredibly different for those two age groups. The adults remain at the nesting site. They likely molt. We're exploring this a little bit more this year. They probably relocate to some extent, trying to optimize their habitat. But they wait there until they depart on their initial migratory journey from the island. Whereas the juveniles leave the nesting site, visit the entire island, but their pattern of movement changes with time. So to go back to the island here, during the first week or so after they initiate movement, they're moving back and forth. But as it gets closer to when they're departing, they start bunching up on the west spit here, which is the closest point to land, and are detected a lot more frequently there. So they initially are exploring, and then they start moving towards the new. So the second set of studies related to fall migration, and here we're interested in whether migration is innate or learned, or whether migratory behavior changes with age. So we're going to get timing, so when they leave the island, migratory route, and then the decisions on the route they make with respect to particular crossing water barriers. So we're looking at a much broader scale. The first thing we can look at is just departure dates, and you can see very clearly that all of the juveniles, virtually all of the juveniles, leave before the adults. So that means that learning the migratory route, or the migratory route is innate, it isn't learned. If it was learned, they would have to be departing at the same time as the adult. And they remain separate through the entire first path of migration. So again, the fact that they are using this innate knowledge for migration has big implications for landscape conservation. The next question is, which routes do they take, And they have basically three options. They can go to the mainland, they can go directly to Cape Cod, or they can go inland. And it turns out that the juveniles and the adults do two different things. The adults almost all stay in the coastal area, which is the best habitat for the species, and then cross the Gulf of Maine in one long flight. So they don't perceive the Gulf of Maine as a barrier. This relates to connectivity. We have to think about perception of barriers of animals as being species specific. But here we're showing that these adults are crossing directly, whereas many of the hatchiers are taking more they're circumnavigating the bay, so that perception of the risk of crossing, the connectivity differs for those two age groups. Let me just speed up a little bit here. So compared to the adults, the juveniles depart early, migrate based on innate knowledge, they take the less risky route over the Gulf of Maine, and some of them take alternate routes over the inland Nova Scotia. So there are behavioral differences by age that are due to learning, possibly temporal variation, so because of the time of year, or just ability, the ability of the adults to do things better. So the next study that I'm going to go through is the blackpoll warbler. As I mentioned, these are boreal species, but they also breed in these coastal systems in the Gulf of Maine on islands that are quite boreal. And they undertake this transoceanic migration. So what they do, this picture is a picture of a fat blackpoll warbler. It looks distorted, it's not. They go from being about 10 to 12 grams to being over 20 grams. So they almost double their weight prior to making that flight. And here's a paper where we attach geolocators to birds in the region, and bottom of that, and you can see from the tracks that they do not undertake this transoceanic migration. It takes them almost 100 hours of constant flight. So the questions we're interested in here are, what are they doing before they initiate this transoceanic migration? What does this post-flight movement look like? And again, we need to think about scales. There's several hypotheses for movement, but some of them are related to habitat, which tends to have impact on a fine scale, and others relate to exploration, which have a broader scale. And finally, the ones that relate to initiating migration, which perhaps activate on a broader scale. And we know that juvenile songbirds during this post-migratory period do select habitat. Adults and hatcheries both move into denser habitats, but we don't really know whether that process is embedded within a movement process at a broader scale. We don't know how much they move, what scale they move at that broader scales. We do know a little bit from banding, but you do find them sometimes quite distant, but we don't know much. So we set out to answer that question, trying to differentiate between the hypotheses related to habitat, exploration, or commencement of migration, and did the same thing we did with the Ipswich sparrows, comparing movements of hatchiers that are inexperienced and older birds, adult birds that are experienced. We can look at how much they move through time, how far away they get from the breeding area, the net displacement, and the cumulative displacement. And quickly, we tagged about 25 birds, and we saw that the extent of movement, so that is how far they ended up, was quite different. The adults ended up much further away from the natal cycle of young, but this was consistent with incidental captures. What was truly remarkable, there were two things that were truly remarkable about this study. And one was all of the adults, and virtually all of them, crossed the Gulf of Maine. So again, they didn't perceive this as a barrier or as risk, and moved down the coast to Cape Cod. None, or virtually none, of the hatchier birds did this. So they're moving about, first of all, they're moving a lot, like 10 times more than most people ever thought they did. And they're moving in completely different ways, likely because their underlying motivation for the process differs between the two groups. Here's just another way of looking at it. The green dots are adults. This is time. This is longitude. This is latitude and time. And the orange dots are the hatch years. And you can see the adults move down the coast with time, whereas the juveniles move up and then back down. So the juveniles are moving as much, they don't get very far away, probably because of the geography of Nova Scotia. But the adults are clearly moving further down the coast, probably to help with initiation migration. So hatch years, no westward inclination, and likely perceive this barrier as a risk. The adults use this area that's outside of the innate group that the juveniles use, and we recall the transoceanic migration and then the birds coming back up the coast in the spring. So the adults would have experienced this coastline the previous spring. There's the hatch years, obviously. So just in summary, I think we've seen with these two species, but also many of the other species we've worked at, that movement during this post-breeding and even into migration period at the regional scale is actually very common. By regional scale, I mean hundreds of kilometers. So thinking about migratory systems in terms of very local areas is just not going to work. The function of the movements, at least some of the function of the movements, has to differ by age. The adults are more likely in the commencement of migration, whereas the hatch years are more likely exploring the landscape, coastal features, geomagnetic fields in order to learn where they need to come back to the next year. And the learning appears to alter those innate patterns. So we can look very quickly at the same species, black-polled warbler, to see what happens with migrant birds. We, in addition to these local breeding populations, we get populations from as far north and west as Alaska that migrate through the area that are temporarily separated, so we know. And they make the transatlantic crossing from Nova Scotia and England. So we quickly look at that and see whether those differences between ages persist this far into migration. So we tagged a number of birds again. We tagged them at different islands. I won't get into that. But here are the same sorts of plots showing what those birds did. And the long and short of it is that there's no difference. So by the time, this is maybe 2 or 3 weeks into migration, these birds have some of them may have already traveled several thousand kilometers. And by that time, the patterns of movements exhibited by adults and young birds are not distinguishable in our study. So this suggests that they've actually learned by that point how to interpret risk and are interacting with the landscape in the same way as adults. I think that the key thing here is that there's no difference in experience, which suggests that there's flexibility within species and age classes in terms of this learning interaction. So, key points: landscapes differ for adults and young. We've shown that post-fledging movement processes act at multiple scales. We've known they've acted at fine scales, but we now know that there are these broader scale movements that come into play, and the decisions at one scale, like crossing a barrier, have implications for subsequent patterns of movement, depending on geography, and probably a bunch of other things. And the other important thing is that for most species, what's considered a landscape is completely unknown. So we don't know what it is, but also the young birds themselves don't know what it is. So there's going to be a lot of location-specific interactions between what the individuals do during that period. So this is just again to remind, just to remind us of where this all fits in, and to remind you, I guess, that there is a lot of focus on this fine scale and broad scale work, but the work that in conversations I've had that we're doing at this sort of landscape scale, I would call regional scale, landscape scale, it doesn't matter, is incredibly important because it really does fill a gap and aligns well with policy, with conservation planning, and so not only is there a lot of new scientific knowledge gained by working in at this regional scale, but it's also quite important. So with that, I'll end and say thank you very much.
Vamos a la dinámica de las preguntas, hacer algunas preguntas aquí en el auditorio, después si hay alguna pregunta externa y finalmente por el canal de YouTube o por el correo. Entonces aquí en el auditorio, ¿tenemos alguna pregunta?
Si alguien tiene problemas superando con la pregunta en inglés, lo puede escribir en un papel y lo seguimos.
Para que no le superen. ¿No? Bueno. Sí.
Thanks. Well, it's just a small question. Have the adult birds guarantee the two volumes of the young ones if they differ of the landscape evolve?
So how did the young ones guide? How did the adults guide the young ones?
Yeah, because they differ of the landscape they fly.
Yes.
So how did young ones know why they encounter in that process?
So I think what you're asking is how do the young birds know where to go? Is that correct? Yeah. That's a great question. With the sparrows on Sable Island, it's this very isolated island, as I showed you. Here we go. So it's this very isolated island. It's 200 kilometers offshore. You can't see it from the shore. The birds can't see it. So what must be going on is very, very, very strong selection for flying west. Most birds have sort of an innate pre-programmed migratory route, which is likely very simple. And with Ipswich sparrows, the first part of that route has to be fly west until that program has to be fly west until you find land. Because a bird that flies any direction from here around to about here is a dead bird. So this is a really nice case. And I didn't mention this, but all of the juveniles except 2, 3 that we tagged were detected on the mainland. So they all managed to do this. We've done some spring work, and you can imagine we'll do some more this year that finding this tiny little island the next spring is probably the bigger challenge. We did some preliminary work a couple of years ago. We tagged 20 individuals along the coast here, and we only ever saw 12 of them on the island. So we think that probably that part of the migratory route is the most difficult. So again, then that means there's very strong selection to learn where this place is. And that's why we think that the young birds fly around so much up and down the island. They don't want to go over the ocean because they're perceiving it as a risk. The more they fly up and down the island, the better they're able to calibrate their celestial compass, their geomagnetic compass, and figure out how to get back there next year. So for other species, we don't know enough because it's not as nice, but we think it's a similar kind of thing going on with the black hole locals. And we need to look at more species to see just at what scale different species interact with the landscape to be able to put together these routes maps in order to get back there next year.
Bien, ¿tenemos preguntas externas? ¿No? Por el canal. Hello, Taylor. We have one question from the University of Guatemala. And the question is, according to your study, movements on a regional scale are the key to the conservation of migratory species?
So movements at the regional scale.
The movements on a regional scale are the key to the conservation of migratory species.
Okay, I'm missing two words. Are key. Oh, are they key?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry, thank you. So yes, the question is, are those movements at the regional scale key to the species? Yeah, I mean, I think you can say that about a lot of things, but let's go back to this one of these diagrams. And there have been very few studies looking at sort of what happens in terms of demography of populations over this whole time frame. But the studies that have been done show that the bulk of all of the mortality that occurs during spring migration or during fall migration. So very little mortality actually occurs during breeding. A bit more occurs during winter, but not as much. So if there are bottlenecks in terms of those demographic parameters, mortality, then they're likely to occur in these periods. So that post-breeding movement at the regional scale is the time from when those young birds leave their adults, their parents, and start doing things on their own. And they have to learn very, very quickly. This is true for songbirds and raptors, lots of other things. And lots of mortality occurs during that period. So I think that's a good sign that it is likely key. And then given that the processes are occurring at that regional scale, I think it means that we really need to be thinking about conserving landscapes for these species and probably lots of others at much broader spatial scales than we are. So that's a long way of saying yes.
Thank you. Bien, ¿tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más?
Yes, I think it's a wonderful job in terms of the continental scale. But what about the role in the south? So these are like grassland rivers in small island, and then they arrive in the tropics, and what they do there, how is their interaction with the landscape in the south? Because I think they are like very specific for the northern grasslands, but in the south it will be different.
So are you talking about species that are non-migratory, that are only tropical, or
No,
when they're in the wintering grounds? Okay, another great question. And I think we don't know actually enough about the scales of movement of many birds in their wintering grounds. There have been a couple of recent studies. Two African ones and one from South America, showing actually substantial movement of individuals in the winter. The African ones were European cuckoos, where they move over the scale of all of Africa in the winter, chasing the rains. And so they start out in West Africa and end up in East Africa and then migrate north to there. This is apparently the pattern. So movements occurring in the very broad spatial scale there. The other study, I don't know the details, but was with more-tailed flycatchers in South America. And again, I think these wintering movements are really we had the work that's going on in Colombia is being done by a PhD student at the University of Saskatchewan, Ana Gonzalez. She's working with Keith Hobson, and they're looking at movements, altitudinal movements of swings and some gray cheek thrushes, and canary warblers and coffee plantations. And they, it's not my data, I don't know a lot about it, but they're seeing a lot of altitudinal movements, and then they're seeing birds leave their study areas weeks before they initiate migration. So there's likely movement at a couple of different scales. Either just before they settle into winter territories, during the period of time that they're in winter territories, and elsewhere. There's a paper given by, I think, one of the Bailey students at a conference in the summer where they showed, they were looking at, I think it was gray cheek thrushes, doesn't matter when they were thrushes, and they were studying them in their study area, and they only ever found patchier birds. So clearly, there's even inter-year movements because they're only the patchier birds, and then they must know the next year. So they must be exploring to know where to go next year. So I think it's completely open on what we have to learn, and it's a really good example of just a lot of the things we need to know are at some level really simple, like what's the scale of movement of all of these different species in their wintering grounds? How does it change through time? It sounds, at some level, it's kind of a boring question, but it's fundamental to so many other things, and fundamental to designing studies. And one of Victor's last slides was make sure you're choosing the appropriate scale for your landscape study. Well, if you don't know the scale of the processes, then you can't choose the appropriate scales. I think that's one of the key things.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Nuestra siguiente conferencia, titulada Defining Landscape Connectivity with Neutral Landscape Model, Critical Thresholds in Landscape Connectivity and the Potential of Invasive Spread, está a cargo de la doctora Kimberly D de la Universidad del Estado de Kansas, de Estados Unidos. La doctora D estudió biología en la Universidad Estatal de San Francisco. Realizó sus estudios de maestría en la Universidad de Arizona del Norte y los de doctorado en la Universidad Estatal de Colorado. Su línea de investigación consiste en analizar las causas y consecuencias de la heterogeneidad ecológica y el efecto recíproco del patrón espacial en los procesos ecológicos mediante la implementación de modelos computacionales de simulación en paisajes virtuales, así como en parcelas experimentales tanto en campo como en laboratorio. Actualmente se encuentra asociada a la Universidad Estatal de Kansas, adscrita como profesora en el Departamento de Biología y como directora del Laboratorio de Ecología del Paisaje y de la Conservación, YACE por sus siglas en inglés. Our next conference, Defining Landscape Connectivity with Neutral Landscape Model, Critical Thresholds in Landscape Connectivity and the Potential of Invasive Spread, in charge of Dr. Kimberly D from Kansas University State. Dr. Mead studied biology in San Francisco State University, and she did her master in the North Arizona University and her PhD in Colorado State University. Her research area is to analyze the causes and consequences of ecological heterogeneity, the reciprocal effects of the spatial pattern in the ecological process through the use of computational models in virtual landscape simulation and in experimental studies in the natural field and laboratory. She is part of the Kansas State University. She's a professor in the biology department and as head of the Laboratory of Landscape and Conservation Ecology. Agradecemos la presencia de la doctora Witt y le damos la bienvenida.
Buenas tardes. Again, I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to come here. I've never been to Mexico before, so this has been a rare treat. And I think we learned so much from all of you. So hopefully now we have a chance to reciprocate. When I was invited to this colloquium, it was suggested that I talk about some of my earlier work on neutral landscape models and how that had been applied to assess landscape connectivity, and then particularly within the context of invasive spread. So hopefully this work is still relevant. Perhaps it's new to some of you. I'm going to move this out because I hear if I stand behind the podium, I will disappear. So the first question that I'm going to pose is, why might landscape structure be particularly important for understanding invasive spread? And one of the big issues that we're confronting in this colloquium is the fact that humans are now the primary drivers of landscape change. And so we're seeing at this point in time landscapes being transformed faster than ever before. Clearly, the consequences of habitat, that anthropogenic land use, is the loss and possibly the fragmentation of native habitats. And because habitat loss and fragmentation are viewed as sort of a landscape-wide phenomenon, and disturbance in and of itself is generally recognized as facilitating the invasion of many species, to the point where this quote from Fox and Fox said that there was no invasion of natural communities without some degree of disturbance. And so it stands to reason that given the nature of anthropogenic disturbances, how widespread these are globally, that they're impacting landscapes all over the world, that we should combine these approaches and adopt a landscape ecological perspective in understanding how landscape pattern gives rise then, or can affect these different processes that give rise to invasive spread. So here I've incorporated a schematic, a diagram that attempts to illustrate some of the different stages of invasive spread. This is not to suggest that a given species would necessarily move through all of these. There are probably as many routes to invasive spread as there are invasive species. But just to give us a conceptual framework, a way of thinking about when and where and how landscape pattern might be important, how it might be influential in affecting these various processes. And so to begin, there's the whole issue of introduction. And initially, I had not considered that landscape structure would have a very important influence on the introduction of invasive species. So many of these are done either purposely or accidentally through major shipping routes or ports entry, that it just didn't seem likely. But it was quickly pointed out to me that topographic constraints that influence human land use patterns might indeed facilitate the introduction of certain types of invasive species. So where we think about low-lying areas as being the first to be cultivated, where natural vegetation is cleared and converted then to agricultural land uses, those low-lying areas often provide that initial entry into the landscape for these non-native species, particularly plants, which then can start to spread outward from the agricultural areas up into higher elevation and potentially then into the natural vegetation type. So it's possible that even at this initial stage of introduction, that there could be some landscape effects. The process of colonization is related to the distribution of suitable sites for that particular species. So just because a species is introduced doesn't obviously mean that it will be successful, that it will be able to colonize at that particular location. And in fact, most introductions fail. The problem is, again, the sheer number of species or the propagules that are being introduced into these landscapes. Eventually, when we introduce enough of them, something is going to be able to take hold. So again, here, however those colonizations, whatever those suitable sites are for that particular species, the distribution, and potentially across a range of scale, particularly at that global scale of introduction, should obviously influence colonization success. The next stage in this process involves establishment. And this is where we now have a number of individuals. We're building up a population that is now self-sustaining. Once the population has been able to become viable at that particular location, it may go unnoticed for quite some time. There's often these lags before invasive spread really takes off, but it stands to reason, of course, that any of these landscape factors that might influence demographic processes, such as reproductive output and mortality, would likely influence population growth rates, and therefore the likelihood that these species can successfully establish. Once one or more of these populations becomes established, this is where the potential for invasive spread begins to increase. So if we're going to establish outlying populations, there must be some way of dispersing. And again, often the concern is for those species who, humans have been able to facilitate the transport, the movement of these species beyond what otherwise might pose barriers. So across oceans or across deserts on interstate highways. And so clearly, the distribution or the mode of dispersal and how that interacts with landscape structure is important. And this then can lead to the establishment of a spatially distributed population, what we might think of as a meta population, or maybe it's a sourcing dynamic. But the idea here is that now we've got a much more widespread distribution. We have multiple viable populations spread out across the landscape that are connected to varying degrees by dispersal. And there's also this really interesting pattern that might emerge in some species. It's referred to as these nascent foci. And so this is an example of an invasive marsh grass, Spartina, that is invading the west coast of the United States. And what's compelling about this is that you can actually see these foci, these points of expansion beyond, well, here's the grass out here, but then we have these little foci where the grass becomes established, and then it begins to expand and coalesce, and then eventually will form this monotypic stand of this invasive grass. And so this, I think, is a particularly interesting pattern of establishment and for spatially distributed populations. But it's by no means the only way in which this can happen. And the idea is that if a species has been successful in having been introduced, having found suitable sites for colonization, having established numerous populations that are connected via dispersal, that spread can now take place. And so this, again, is just meant to provide a conceptual framework for thinking about where and how landscape structure can influence these various stages. But the questions that I'm going to try to address here relate to how landscape fragmentation affects the pattern and process of spread. So what levels of habitat loss and or degree of fragmentation can promote this process of invasive spread. And the flip side of this then would be to what extent could we hope to manage landscapes to mitigate the risk of these species being able to spread widely across these landscapes. And so at the time, I was quite intrigued by these neutral landscape models. And these are really nothing more. They can be developed in different ways, but I'm going to be talking about these grid-based or raster-based landscapes in which habitat is distributed by some algorithm, some theoretical distribution, and I'll show different ways of doing this in just a moment. But the reason these are called neutral landscape models is that, in effect, these are a null model. We're not dealing with the real structure of a landscape where we've got various biotic and abiotic forces that are shaping the distribution of habitat. This is purely theoretical, but it gives us a baseline for understanding then how processes interact with a certain amount of habitat or degree of fragmentation. And so today I'm going to be talking about this specifically in the context of invasive spread. Tomorrow I'll be showing ways in which we can implement this to test some of these ideas experimentally. But today it's more about establishing the theoretical basis for this. So just to give you a quick overview of how landscape connectivity and therefore the potential for the a process like invasive spread can occur is described or quantified within the context of these neutral landscape models. We can look at a gradient of landscapes that are undergoing a pattern or a degree of habitat loss. And so we can imagine that we started off with a landscape that had originally 100% habitat. And we've gone in and just randomly, into these little individual cells, randomly removed the habitat. And so if we look at a landscape in which we've removed 20% habitat, and we look at the degree to which the remaining habitat is connected to other habitat cells, this is the extent of the largest patch on the landscape. And you can see that although there's some perforations in this landscape, but the remaining habitat, that 80% of habitat that remains, is still fully connected. The idea is that, for example, if there was a species that can only move through this habitat, that it could basically percolate, start from one end of the landscape and move from cell to cell to cell and traverse the entire landscape. That's not to suggest that it will, it's just that in theory it could. So the intriguing thing then is to try and explore what happens as we continue to whittle away at the habitat on the landscape. So we continue to remove habitat, so we remove another 20%, such that we have 40% total removed, 60% left. And what I'm trying to do here is highlight the largest patch on the landscape. The gray or dark areas are still natural vegetation patches. But all I'm doing here is highlighting the largest one. And by looking at this, we can see that, again, although this large patch is completely riddled with holes, that technically speaking, it still allows for percolation across the entire landscape. Again, if an organism, for example, was on this large patch, it could potentially move from one side of the landscape to the other. So at this stage, we might be thinking, oh, okay, so we can keep whittling away at the natural vegetation, and maybe, if we're not doing this in a targeted fashion, but in a purely random fashion, something really interesting happens in this domain here. And you'll note that it's only a difference of about 5%. And so from a land management standpoint, where you've already lost 40%, what's another 5%? You could still have 55% of the landscape intact. So it might not seem like that would be such a big deal. But again, if we're doing this purely at random, which admittedly may not be the most efficient or economical way to go about harvesting, or if we have a forested landscape here, for example. You'll note now that the largest patch, as highlighted here, does not span the entire landscape. And so it's at this point, in the context of percolation theory and the way that connectivity is defined using these neutral landscape models, that we would say that the landscape has become disconnected. Because at this stage, although there's still 55% of the landscape habitat, an individual or organism that was constrained only to move through habitat would not be able to move very far. And as the farthest it could move, potentially, is just in this largest patch. And so beyond that, as we continue to remove habitat, all we're doing is reducing patch size at that point. We're not altering the overall connectivity of the landscape. So this is just, again, sort of a pictorial to demonstrate the process and how this is defined. But what's nice is we can quantify this. We can graph the probability that landscapes, if we create 100 landscapes with 80% habitat cover, what percentage of those would have this percolation cluster? And at 80%, 100% of them would. But as we start to go down, so here's 60%, most of them, not all, but most, 80% of the landscapes that we could generate with this random distribution, 80% habitat, 60% habitat, would percolate. But by convention, we use this 50% cutoff as sort of a way of dichotomizing whether we have a connected or disconnected landscape. And so where this line intersects, where this curve intersects, gives us a way then of defining the critical threshold at which, or below which, the landscape is considered to be disconnected. And so in this example, it occurs around 58, 59% habitat. So if we go down to 57%, then we would expect the landscape to become disconnected. So this is just showing the point where we would define that critical threshold. And so it hypothesized that identifying these critical thresholds in landscape connectivity could be a way to define when landscapes become fragmented, or at least when they became disconnected. Maybe this would have consequences for a variety of other ecological processes, but it really does depend upon the pattern of flow across these landscapes, the scale at which these processes interact with landscape pattern. And just to show that we have a great deal of creativity that we can use in terms of generating these different types of landscapes. And because one of the issues that has already been brought up, I believe, in Victor's presentation earlier, is the need to distinguish between those effects that are due to habitat loss versus those that are due to habitat fragmentation. And one way we can parse those differences is by using these types of neutral landscape models. We're generated using a fractal distribution, a fractal algorithm. But for the same amount of habitat, we can create a gradient in terms of the degree of fragmentation. And so this gives us a way then, if we control for the amount of habitat loss, we can adjust independently the degree of fragmentation to see which is having the greater effect on this process of interest, in this case, maybe it's a spread. Well, just to show you, again, I'm very visual, so I like to see pictures to help me understand. And this is just to point out that if we can create these scenarios where we have different types of landscapes which vary in, which differ in the amount of area, in this case disturbed. If we're thinking about this from the standpoint of an invasive species that's colonizing disturbed areas of the habitat, and we can examine different ways in which this disturbance is created, either naturally or artificially, if you will, through human land uses. you can see that in a case where even with a relatively low level of disturbance, if it's all concentrated in one part of the landscape, and particularly in a way that spans the entire landscape, then this sort of landscape scenario would enable, potentially, a species to spread like wildfire across the entire landscape. Whereas a landscape in which the disturbances were small and more dispersed throughout the landscape, this would be the largest extent of spread for a single introduction. I mean, again, you could argue that if we're introducing species in multiple places, that we could still affect that kind of a widespread invasion. But again, this is just a way of visualizing how the amount of disturbance relative to the pattern of disturbance might be contributing to the potential risk of spread in different landscape scenarios. And just very quickly, we can quantify this because land managers like to have a target. Tell me how much habitat I can potentially destroy, or how much habitat do we need to maintain to ensure that invasive spread isn't going to occur. And this is showing that if we interpret this in terms of risk of spread now, that for a relatively low level of disturbance, we see the greatest potential emerging in these landscapes where disturbances are highly concentrated, as we saw in that previous figure. That makes sense. And so the idea then is that for a species that is only moving from one cell, not a very good dispersal, but it's moving basically from one disturbed area to another, then its pattern of spread, its rate of spread, potentially is going to be much greater in these landscapes with a concentrated pattern of disturbance. But what if we're dealing with something that is a slightly better dispersor, something that maybe can be through seeds or wind dispersed, and so they can cross these small gaps of unsuitable size. In the context of these percolation models, we're just expanding our definition of patch then. Will include not just the disturbed areas that are next to our focal cell, but we will allow the potentially invasive species to cross small gaps that are one cell wide. And you could make this neighborhood size any size, whatever might be relevant to a particular species. But the interesting thing here is that if we change that scale of movement so that now we're allowing a slightly larger dispersal range, it completely flips around our expectations about which landscape will facilitate invasive spread. And so remember that when dispersal was very localized, when it was only going from one disturbed cell to another, the fastest rate or the greatest potential for spread was in landscapes with a concentrated pattern of disturbance. If we instead have a species that's capable of some small level of dispersal beyond that they can cross small gaps, now it turns out that the greatest potential for spread, at least under the lowest level of disturbance, actually occurs in these landscapes that have very small and widely or randomly dispersed disturbances. So this is completely opposite to what we had seen previously. And presumably the reason for this is that if it's a species that can cross small gaps, then it can potentially colonize or spread into these small sites of disturbance and use them as stepping stones to get across the landscape. And so overall then, we were to try to summarize the first part of this, poor dispersers in general probably will do best when disturbances are concentrated on the landscape, but slightly better dispersers are going to do, best in landscapes that are more fragmented, where these disturbances are small but widely spaced across the landscape. So this is a challenge because in any given landscape, we're probably dealing with species that exhibit different types of dispersal. And so how do you manage a landscape where any which way you do it, we seem to be doomed. You know, if you try to manage it to slow the rate of spread for these species, classifying as core dispersers, we might then be creating a landscape that promotes the spread of these other species. So the main thing then, at this stage, all we're doing is looking at the potential for spread. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it just gives us one way, kind of a coarse approximation. But what we really like to be able to do is to link these demographic and these characteristics of the species themselves with landscape pattern. And to do this, I can just show you some of the work really quickly here that we've done in the past that have explored specifically how dispersal is expected to interact with landscape pattern, and then separately, how might demographic processes interact with landscape structure. As Phil Taylor's just talked about a little while ago, you hopefully, maybe from your own experience, know how difficult it is to study dispersal, to study movements of highly mobile organisms. And so some of the theory, some of the first approximations that we've had have necessitated this more theoretical approach where we need some way of guiding our studies or just to give us some insights into the levels of habitat loss and fragmentation that might adversely affect movement or conversely promote movement. And so just to highlight now, in the context of invasive spread, but really probably any sort of species, how do these characteristics, these life history traits interact with landscape structure? And so to begin, I'm just going to talk about this part of this diagram, how landscape affects the movements, is expected to affect the movements, and specifically here, of the species itself, or it could be its dispersal factor, yes. And so once again, the approach is to generate these different landscapes across a gradient of habitat amount and degree of fragmentation, and then use simulation modeling to basically simulate the movements of different types of species that differ in their dispersal rules of their ability to move across these landscapes. And again, this can be a very complicated analysis because there's lots of different ways that you can model movement. I'm just going to show you one result here, which is just using a very simple nearest neighbor rule. For, again, kind of a poor dispersal that's moving from disturbed area to disturbed area. And as you might anticipate that, for something that's an invasive species, the more landscape disturbed potentially, the better. And so dispersal success, the ability to find suitable habitat, given that suitable habitat is defined as disturbed habitat, is initially high, particularly in these landscapes that are where the disturbance is concentrated. But it does start to decline more linearly in these landscapes that are more fragmented. And the interesting thing, I think, is that in both cases, there's this apparent threshold that occurs, this abrupt nonlinear decline in dispersal success. It occurs, roughly in this 20% domain. Quibble, I suppose, about exactly how it's defined and where it occurs. And, we thought this was pretty interesting and, what to make of it and whether this, again, it's just a hypothesis that deserves to be tested. But about the same time, another group, Cunningham and Huntley, were looking at this from the standpoint of the ability of trees to migrate in response to climate change. And so, of course, trees aren't picking up their roots and moving. What they're doing is sending out their propagules, and so it's a multi-generational range shift that occurs. But it's a type of regional invasion, and we know that it's occurred in, at least in temperate regions of in the United States, where based upon pollen analysis, we know that these species distributions have shifted over, over millennia in response to glacial expansion and retreat. And so, interestingly, they took this kind of a neutral modeling approach to explore for a couple of different tree species at what point and whether the modern landscape might facilitate the ability of these species to track climate change. And so their landscapes are more like linear transects, but it's the same idea where in this case the trees are looking for suitable sites for colonization. So those are the black squares on these. And what I thought was really compelling and why I highlighted this particular example is that they too were finding these abrupt declines in dispersal success, or the ability, what they were calling migration rate, the ability of these trees to potentially track climatic changes, given that the modern landscape now, is full of cities and agricultural fields that may be very difficult to overcome through the dispersal of pollen and seeds. So just again, another way maybe of being able to use this approach to come up with some scenarios and expectations. Okay, I'm going to come back to some of these major conclusions, but the point here is there might be something to this where dispersal is expected to be lower below 20% habitat. The second aspect of a species response to landscape pattern, besides dispersal, is the population or the demographic response. And so the next part of this presentation is just taking a quick look at one way in which landscape pattern might influence the ability of a putative invasive species to become established. And this was actually, this kind of work that we were doing was actually done in a completely different context. But it just shows that you can really, the process is the same, whether we're talking about a species that's invasive or whether we're talking about a species that's of conservation concern. Those species would seem to be, at opposite ends of this gradient of response, and perhaps they are, but it is a gradient. And so if you can look at the full suite of dispersal abilities and population demographic responses to different types of disturbances, you can capture all of that. And so we were actually, in this particular paper, we're trying to look at the effects of habitat loss and fragmentation on the migratory bird populations. But I think it still has relevance for...
La base de datos de virus ha sido actualizada.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to make sure we weren't getting, call to rebuild it or something. One way that, at least that occurred to us, that landscape habitat loss and fragmentation could potentially influence demographic rates is through these negative edge effects, where, for example, if you were looking at this from the standpoint of reproductive output, the number of propagules or offspring that are being produced, for many species, but by no means all, but for many species, we find this sort of negative response where reproductive output is highest in large patches, but then begins to decline and may decline very rapidly in patches that are small or that are linear, in which the edge and the associated ecological interactions like increased predation, increased parasitism, increased competition can have a negative influence on reproductive success. And so we were thinking about one response, one way that landscape structure could influence demography then is through these well-known negative edge effects, and then just logically following this through. If we're thinking about fragmented landscapes, which are made up of lots of small patches, which are dominated by, or small patches have more edge, therefore these landscapes should be dominated by negative edge effects, and so reproductive output overall should be lower, that is, population growth should be lower in these landscapes. And so just one way of characterizing population growth is this character called lambda. What's most important here is just to know that if it's a lambda of 1, that population is stable. We consider that then the viability threshold. Below 1, the population declines, and above 1, the population is increasing. And so if we're talking about this from the standpoint of an invasive species, then the issue is, what level of habitat disturbance and fragmentation would potentially push the population into, that zone where population growth rates are exceeding 1. There's a high risk of growth and then potentially spread. And so, again, we did this for these different scenarios where disturbances were either small and localized or were aggregated to varying degrees. And this is just to show that, again, if we're looking at this purely from the standpoint of demographic responses, then once again, populations are likely to do better from the standpoint of population growth in landscapes where you have these concentrated disturbances. So establishment should be higher than those kinds of landscapes. Well, so if you've been following, we're getting all kinds of different responses. In some cases, dispersal success is greatest when the landscape, when the disturbance is concentrated. For other types of dispersers, they do best when there are stepping stones, so small and dispersed disturbances. And now we're seeing something completely different in terms of demographic response. And so in terms of trying to anticipate or predict the response of a given invasive species to landscape disturbance, we have to consider the potential contrasting effects of landscape pattern on dispersal versus demography, versus these demographic responses. And to my knowledge, the only study that has really addressed this was this experimental design. It's published, a long time ago now. But what the investigators did is they created this array with these different patches of disturbance. So some of them were very large and regularly spaced. Some of these were large patches but clumped together. And then hopefully you can see there's some intermediate size and some smaller disturbances. And so in the field, and using a sort of a model invasive species, it's groundsel or Senecio vulgaris, so very common weed. Investigators found that dispersal was actually greatest in these more fragmented habitats. That is where the distribution was uniform, but that the species established best, and it's dealing with these demographic processes, where the disturbances were more aggregated in space. So you're getting these completely contrasting effects, depending upon whether it's dispersal or establishment that we're talking about. And just to kind of summarize the results of our own research, you've already seen these top graphs. I'm just simply showing the effect, the magnitude of the effect size, what in risk analysis is referred to as an added risk. So this is answering the question, when does the pattern of disturbance matter? Not just the amount of disturbance, but when does the pattern matter? And so if we're just talking about dispersal success or pollination success, this pattern, this difference between having a clump versus a fragmented distribution, again, really only matters at really low levels of habitat disturbance. And then once you get to a certain amount of landscape disturbed, it may not matter whether the disturbance is small and dispersed or whether it's concentrated. Eventually, it's just the sheer magnitude of the amount of landscape disturbed. Similarly, if we're looking at population growth and establishment, the greatest effect, at least that we found in our scenarios, again, is within this relatively small range at fairly low levels of landscape disturbance. This is where we see the greatest difference in how landscape pattern is influencing these population growth rates. So if, and again, this is a big if, but if this, what's the take-home message from this? If we were to put this in more of a management context, this might suggest that, regardless of whether it's dispersal or colonization or establishment that has a greater effect on invasive spread, maybe we should just try to ensure that less than 30 to 40% of the landscape where we tend to see the greatest impact of landscape pattern, let's try to keep the amount of landscape disturbed below that, because otherwise this landscape pattern is not sufficient to mitigate the potential risk of spread. The final thing I'm going to talk about, I don't want to keep this for all lunch, so people are probably getting hungry. But one other issue, and I think this speaks to the other theme of the colloquium dealing with resilience. So what about the ability of communities to resist invasion? And there's been quite a bit of research that's been done on that. We also took a look at this, again, from a very different standpoint, for a different context, but it fits because, again, it's general, it's theory, and so, it has something, it can inform our understanding of how landscape pattern influences the invasibility of communities. And, without going into all the gory details, once again, we're coupling these neutral landscape models, although in this case, they're going to be heterogeneous. I'm going to show you in just a moment what they look like. But we're coupling that with a model which is based on a complex systems approach. Very simple rules are used to control the emergence of species and their interactions. This trophic structure emerges in these landscapes such that they self-organize. We don't have this top-down. We just program a few simple rules and let it run, and these complex communities, these trophic webs form on these landscapes. But as with any community, species do occasionally go extinct, and if it's a linchpin, a keystone species, when it goes extinct, it's potentially taking all those other species that depend upon it with it. So there are these extinction events that occur totally on their own, no asteroids or perturbations on our part. They're intrinsic to the model, and so we want to understand under what landscape conditions then promote the greatest degree of resilience to these mass extinction events. And so, linking this to invasive spread, the introduction, the evolution or the introduction of a new species is a type of invasion into that community, and that can destabilize the community. But is there a certain level of community richness, of diversity, that would then withstand the introduction of other species? And if so, is it at all influenced by landscape pattern, and how many species might that be? So we call this critical biodiversity. Critical biodiversity is the number of species in a community where these communities self-organize, but then they become resistant to mass extinctions, where you don't have these cascades of extinctions occurring. There's redundancy built in, there's greater resilience overall. And so what we want to do then is explore across a range of these heterogeneous landscapes. And in this first scenario, all we did was, we came up with 6 different cover types. They were all equally abundant, so 17%. And we just varied the degree of contagion. And what we found was that, this is kind of a different sort of graph, but on this axis we have the susceptibility to invasion, so it's the number of species that go extinct per unit time, I believe. And this is the number of species that were occurring that had evolved on the landscape. And so basically all of these different landscape scenarios, these communities evolved to a fairly high or optimal degree of species richness or diversity, but they're very susceptible. I mean, just as they approach this peak, you'll notice that it's highest of all in these landscapes that have a high degree of spatial contagion. And the reason for that is when species interactions are compartmentalized, when they're restricted to just that one habitat type, Again, you get more simple communities forming within that, or more specialized communities, I should say, forming within that habitat. So again, when one species starts to go, everybody goes, but it's pretty much confined to that particular habitat type. What's intriguing is that once you get over that hump, once you get over that point, that critical biodiversity point, which for these landscapes that have a high degree of clumping, need more species than if it's a random array of habitats, then the susceptibility to invasion or to mass extinction then begins to level off. And that's where the community then is predicted to become more stable, more resilient to these mass extinctions. So we thought this was interesting. Again, this is something that, is a hypothesis that should be tested, but it's another way in which we can link these ideas and how we can use these neutral landscape models to explore the effects of habitat disturbance and fragmentation on a particular phenomenon, in this case invasive spread, by looking at different aspects of species characteristics and or community-wide responses. So just to go through some take-home messages here, I hope I've been able to demonstrate why I've been fascinated with these sorts of correlation models in terms of being able to assess the potential for invasive spread, but then breaking it down into looking at specific effects on dispersal versus demography. I don't know to what extent we would always expect to find for any given species these sorts of thresholds, but they are compelling. I think ecological thresholds, again, are compelling and need to be tested, because then otherwise it might be quite a surprise if we don't anticipate these sorts of dramatic effects. Okay, so thinking about this again from a management standpoint, I suggested just to summarize across all these different theoretical studies that we others have done, but there might be something to this idea that if we could manage to keep disturbances to a low level, say below 30%, that maybe we could have some expectation of managing invasive spread. And again, this might also influence where these critical biodiversity thresholds occur in terms of susceptibility to invasion in the first place. But I guess some questions I'd like to leave with you, sort of food for thought, as we say. If we do see these sorts of contrasting effects of landscape pattern on dispersal versus population growth rates, for example, should we purposely fragment landscapes to try and reduce dispersal success? So we're purposely disrupting the connectivity of these disturbed areas. This is kind of analogous to the idea that we can use fire, to create fire breaks and stop the spread of wildfire. But we're not just usually managing the landscape for a single species, even if it's an invasive species. We're also concerned about these species that may be of conservation concern. So if we're on one hand trying to reduce the spread of one species, but trying to promote the population growth and dispersal success of another species, how do you go about developing a landscape management plan that would enable you to successfully reduce spread, but also promote spread, in the species of conservation concern? So really, these are the hard questions that we deal with. There are no singular answer, there's no simple answer to be sure. But it's, again, something that we kind of grapple with. How do you then apply these sorts of predictions, these hypotheses then that we would like to be able to test? So with that, I think I will conclude. Thank you very much.
¿Tiene una pregunta? Compañera Victoria. Tenemos traductora.
question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, the threshold points for plant species are the same for more vital species like birds? Or are the theory, it needs to be different for these species?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. My premise in all of this is that this is very general. It's not, most of what we're doing is not being developed for a specific species, but we're hoping to capture the, the important traits of how species respond in general to landscape pattern, whether it be for dispersal or population growth rates. Now, I would certainly anticipate that we're going to have different species, whether it's a plant or whether it's a bird, that those thresholds would vary. If there are thresholds, they would certainly vary. But how they would, I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. We tend to think of birds because they have wings as being pretty good dispersers, but then we heard today about ifs, which is sparrows, which is easy for me to say, which really don't go that far. And certainly we've seen all kinds of examples of, plant species, maybe facilitated dispersal, but that have been, quite invasive. So I don't know that really answers your question in terms of giving you a yes or no answer, because it really does depend on the scale of interaction with the scale of landscape pattern. That seems to be kind of one of the emerging themes from this colloquium. My argument is that the role of models is to help inform, to help us better understand when is landscape pattern important for what types of species. The next step, I feel, is then to take these kinds of models, parameterize them for, these are very basic, demographic models, but parameterize that for a species for which we actually have data. So, and then we could better address that specific question.
Okay, I have a question. So this is based on theoretical experiments, and so it's not. So in theory, do these persons do better in fragmented landscapes and species that are not good? These persons do better in large disturbances, but in practice, most anthropogenic disturbances are accompanied by roads or some sort of access to a disturbed area. So it seems to me that it would matter much if
Yeah, well, that's a good point. It might not. I mean, it really does depend upon, as you say, the route of introduction, or how the species is introduced in the first place. This is, in that case, like you say, it may not matter. Landscape pattern may be less important for a species that's spreading along roadways. I can't argue that. That's not addressed well by this particular approach, which is looking at, in a very general way, what is the interaction between habitat mount and fragmentation? How does that influence these basic life history characteristics, dispersal demography? And I mean, this is basic population biology, that is combined with a landscape ecological perspective. And that's why I had said previously that from my standpoint, it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about a species of conservation concern or a species that's invasive, which is doing, it has the opposite problem. It's growing too well, or it's spreading too quickly. If we could figure out how to make landscapes, maybe to give some of these other species the characteristics of these invasive species, maybe that would resolve some of these other conservation problems. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of, I mean, models, even if they're general, doesn't mean that they're universal. It doesn't mean that they're going to account for every single scenario. Because I know we can all come up with lots of exceptions where maybe this wouldn't apply. But what does it tell us that we didn't know before? Is it useful to know that there's at least the potential for these threshold effects at a broad landscape scale, that the pattern of disturbance might influence where that threshold occurs, that you might get conflicting effects depending upon whether you're focused primarily on dispersal or demographic response. And maybe for one type of species, dispersal is where really what promotes spread. For another, it might be the ability to establish as a good competitor. And then you would have different recommendations. So yeah, this isn't, the kind of work that I'm presenting here is not meant, even though I think it has implications, it's not a management tool. That would require a different modeling approach. But I hope everyone here at least would agree that general theory has value. It's something that we study in ecology, and it helps to then inform our understanding of these sorts of interactions that are complex and which are difficult to study, which may be difficult to get the data. But then maybe this helps direct those kinds of studies. Where do we, where should we invest our time and our energies and our limited funding for research?
Una pregunta externa. Bueno, una última pregunta aquí.
Thank you very much. I know that what you have presented is pretty much theory, but do you know if it has been attempted before to purposely disrupt or isolate an habitat when an invasive species has been found inside it?
Yeah, actually, I do know. We currently have an invasive insect, the emerald ash borer, in the northeastern tier. It started there anyway. And it's decimating ashes, and I think it's some other trees, but that's the big species of concern. These are trees that lots of people have in their yards. So there's a value associated with them. Many communities have their streets that have a lot of ash planted. And the insect now is spread as far south and west as Kansas City, near where I live. At the time that it was first discovered, they had undertaken what might appear to have been a rather radical solution. They went in and were trying to log a huge area to create a buffer in the hopes of, I don't know, they really believed it would completely prevent the insect. It's often carried in firewood. So people will go up north, collect the firewood and then bring it. And so there's no, again, spreading along roadways. You can't deal with, you can't overcome that except through public outreach and education. But they did attempt to clear a huge region, and it obviously, it didn't succeed. I mean, the insect continued to spread. So yeah, that's one example again where it might seem, here you're concerned about the loss of, the structural integrity, the species integrity of these forests, the loss of ash, and yet they went out and actually ended up cutting or logging a lot in the hopes of being able to reduce that rate of spread. Maybe not particularly successful. Maybe it's limited some.
Agradecemos la presencia de la doctora Luis. Antes de que se retire su comer, les recordamos a los investigadores que tenemos 3 cupos disponibles para la cena de hoy en la Saber 100, para que se anoten con Liliana o con Estrella. Y también recordarles de su voto por el fotoreportaje que más les guste, están afuera, solo hay que anotar el número, por estar la una y